In 1917, the German Empire and the British Empire were killing each other at a rate of 5,000 men per day. But both governments were borrowing money from the same banks. By the time the Treaty of Versailles was signed, more wealth had changed hands through interest payments than through seized territory. The war was decided not by generals, but by accountants. And the bills are still being paid today. This is the part of war they don't teach. When we think of military power, we imagine factories, fleets, and ammunition. But every modern war has been funded the same way, through loans that must be repaid, with interest for decades. Weapons destroy cities. Debt restructures entire nations. The question is not who won the battle. The question is who financed it and what they demanded in return. Before the 20th century, wars were relatively short. Kingdoms fought until their treasuries ran empty, then they stopped. But in the 1700s, Britain developed a new system. Instead of raising taxes to fund wars immediately, the government would borrow against future tax revenue. This allowed conflicts to continue far longer than any medieval army could sustain. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was not a national charity. It was a private institution that loaned money to the government in exchange for guaranteed returns. The longer the war, the more debt accumulated. The more debt accumulated, the more power the creditors held. By the Napoleonic Wars, this model had become the standard. France, Austria, Russia, every major power began borrowing to fight. And the lenders were often the same institutions, neutral in name, but invested in continuation. During World War I, Britain borrowed the equivalent of £1.4 billion from the United States alone. Germany financed its war through bonds sold to its own citizens, promising repayment with interest after victory. Neither side could afford to stop fighting, because stopping meant defaulting on obligations to bondholders. This created a trap. Military defeat was not just a loss of territory. It was a financial collapse that would spread to banks, investors, and civilian savers. Governments had to win or face revolution from their own creditors. Meanwhile, neutral banks in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the United States extended credit lines to both alliances. They were not funding ideology. They were funding interest rates. A German victory or a British victory mattered less than the guarantee that someone would honor the debt. When the war ended, the Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations on Germany totaling 132 billion gold marks. This was not restitution for damages. It was a structured repayment plan designed to keep Germany economically bound to the victors for generations. The debt was so large that Germany could not pay it through normal taxation. It had to borrow more money to pay the interest on existing loans. This is how modern war works. The fighting ends, but the financial architecture remains. Germany attempted to pay its debts by printing money. The result was hyperinflation so severe that currency became worthless within months. Savings evaporated. The middle class was destroyed. And in that economic chaos, extremism found fertile ground. The rise of the Nazi Party was not disconnected from the debt structure imposed in 1919. It was a direct response to financial suffocation. When populations are impoverished by forces they cannot see or vote against, they look for visible enemies and authoritarian solutions. Britain and France, despite winning the war, also drowned in debt. Britain owed the United States so much that its empire began to contract not from military defeats, but from budget constraints. The pound sterling, once the dominant global currency, was slowly replaced by the dollar. Power shifted not through conquest, but through ledgers. By World War II, the same cycle repeated. Nations borrowed, fought, and restructured. The post-war order was built not on ideology alone, but on financial agreements that determined which nations would rise and which would remain subordinate. The debts from World War I were not fully settled until 2010, when Germany made its final reparation payment, 91 years after the Treaty of Versailles. Britain only finished repaying its American loans from both world wars in 2006. This is not ancient history. The financial mechanisms created in those wars still govern how nations operate. When a country faces crisis today, it does not surrender to an occupying army. It negotiates with the International Monetary Fund. It accepts structural adjustment programs. It restructures its debt in exchange for policy concessions. War debt established the principle that economic leverage is more permanent than military occupation. You cannot rebel against a loan agreement the way you can against foreign soldiers. The terms are written into law. The interest payments are automatic. The creditors are often invisible. Modern conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe are still entangled with loans issued decades ago. Nations borrow to fight, then remain economically dependent on the lenders long after the fighting stops. We remember wars for their battles. Verdun, the Somme, Stalingrad, but the treaties that followed those battles were financial contracts, not moral reckonings. The banks that financed the wars profited regardless of the outcome. The governments that borrowed remained bound to repayment schedules that outlasted the generals who ordered the charges. War is not won by the side with the most courage or the best strategy. It is won by the side that can sustain debt the longest. And the cost of that debt is paid not by those who signed the agreements, but by generations born long after the guns went silent. The battlefield is temporary. The balance sheet is forever.